Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Nick Hillman. I'm director of HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, and we're co-hosting this webinar, our first event of 2026, with our colleagues at Advance HE, who HEPI have had a long-standing relationship with, including for our flagship annual Student Academic Experience Survey, and indeed for this series of webinars and in-person events that we've been running for many, many years. And in a moment, I'll hand over to Advance HE's relatively new CEO, Alistair Jarvis, who many people will have come across in some of his previous roles, and Alistair will introduce himself. Tiny bit of housekeeping before I turn to Alistair. This is an on-the-record webinar. If there's some disaster, we won't necessarily make the video available afterwards, but our plan is to run an on-the-record webinar and then post the video up on our YouTube channel afterwards for other people to see and people who can't attend this morning. We've got three excellent speakers who I will introduce in a moment. Just to remind you of the topic for today, it's what can higher education leadership learn from other sectors? And the only other bit of housekeeping I'll say is we are very keen to have a lot of audience participation. So please do put your questions in the Q&A. Technical challenges can go in the chat, but questions in the Q&A. And really importantly, please upvote other people's questions, because I will put the questions that are most popular to our three panelists. But before I introduce our three panelists, over to you, Alistair at Advance HE.
Nick, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you all for taking the time to join us at today's event. Nick kindly asked if I'd make just a few words of introduction to sort of frame today's discussion. First, I just wanted to acknowledge the really strong partnership between Advance HE and HEPI on today's event. And as Nick mentioned, this is the first of a series of 3 events in early 2026. And do take a look online. We are hosting 2 other events in February and March in the Houses of Parliament, and there's details online about those. These events also build on the really close partnership with HEPI on our signature Student Academic Experience Survey, and we are just working on the data collection for that now for the next annual survey. I think I would have met some of you before, but others I don't know. For those of you that don't know Advance HE, we are the higher education sector's development and enhancement agency. We're a global member-led charity, and we work to improve higher education by realising the potential of people working in the sector, which is why today's topic is so important. I think we work across 4 areas of expertise: excellence in teaching, learning and student success, leadership development, governance effectiveness, and equality, diversity and inclusion. Now, I think today's topic is really important, and I'm anticipating a really insightful hour of discussions ahead. When I took on the role as CEO of Advance HE last summer, I started to explore how we can bring far more out-of-sector experience and good practice to our work, and particularly through our leadership development programmes. I think I'm sure you'll agree that the challenges that the higher education sector are facing at the moment feel acute and indeed really immediate. If you look at the combination of funding pressures, of changing demands, of rapid development of AI, and of course the international uncertainty that we're facing across the world that seems to be getting almost worse by the week, these are all necessitating significant challenge, significant change and transformation across all of our institutions in higher education. However, when I reflect on this, I think that many of the challenges we face in higher education are not really that dissimilar to challenges being faced by other sectors. And I think it's really important we do all we can to learn how other sectors are approaching these similar challenges, sharing insights, seeking solutions, looking at how others are solving problems, seeking out sort of good practice. And if, for example, I was speaking recently with a chief constable of a major police force who told me that she faced 25% year-on-year cuts to her budget. And had to deal with that challenge. So these funding challenges are certainly not unique to higher education. You look across at the NHS, and of course they continue to grapple with the ongoing challenges of digitalisation. You look at local government, and they have very serious funding constraints, arguably worse than even higher education has been facing. And of course also ongoing need for service improvement, a need to meet changing expectations of the public. You look at businesses, and they have modernised governance approaches to meet political scrutiny and changing public expectations. So you look at these sort of themes in these areas, and they're certainly not only challenges for higher education. And if you look overall, the need to build capacity, build capabilities to lead and manage transformation and change, I think is something really common across leaders and managers across many sectors. So it's in summary, I think there's just so much we can learn from people, from organisations in many other sectors. And I'm really looking forward to the insights from our expert panel today. Nick's going to chair today's event, and I'm going to hand back to Nick now. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Alistair. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn to our three very experienced speakers on this topic. So our first speaker will be Philippa Hurd. I had the pleasure of serving under Philippa on the board of the University of Manchester, where she is the chair. I'm no longer on the board, but not because Philippa kicked me off, but because I did my 3 years, my 9 years rather, three times three. Now, Philippa's background is very extensive in a number of different sectors. So she has been chair of the NHS Pay Review Body. She's been the senior independent director at Ordnance Survey and also a non-executive director of UK Strategic Command. There's lots of more I could say about Philippa, but I'm going to let Philippa talk about her own experience and expertise in a moment. After Philippa, we will hear from Khadir Meer, who's Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Finance and Operations at SOAS, part of the University of London. He was previously Chief Operating Officer and Deputy CEO of the London Ambulance Service, which I believe, Khadir, is the largest emergency service in the world, emergency ambulance service in the world.
That's what we like to claim, Nick.
Very good. And of course, you were in charge of that during a global pandemic too, so which makes it particularly challenging. And then thirdly, we're going to hear from Rod Bristow, who's a long-standing friend of HEPI's in many roles, and he's currently chair of the University of Bradford, where you're overseeing a recruitment of a new VC, and interesting to see your new interim appointment there, Rod, Nick Braisby. And according to the HEPI LSBU annual Social Mobility Index, Bradford is the best performing university for social mobility in the country. But Rod's expertise is in elsewhere as well. He's founder and CEO of College Online and previously served as president for Global Online Learning and UK at Pearson, FTSE 100 company. And Rod is also very involved with Kaplan, who many of your universities will, library services and students will use, who are a HEPI, long-standing HEPI partner. So with no further ado, they're going to make some opening remarks, 5 to 7 minutes each, and then we'll open it up to the audience Q&A. Please do keep the questions coming in. We'll let you ask your own questions. We'll turn your microphone on, not your camera, but your microphone when it comes to that point of the proceedings. Over to you, Philippa.
Okay, Nick, thank you for that introduction. And thanks for inviting me to do this, and thanks everyone for being with us this morning. So my perspective on the question, the exam question, which was what can HE learn from other sectors, is shaped inevitably by my experience. So I began life in marketing with ICI in the Northwest, actually, for those of you old enough to remember. I then went on to general management with Granada, and as HRD merged ITV companies to become eventually ITV. My non-executive director work includes 9 years with City, University of London, now it's City St George's, the University of Manchester, and support to the governance of 3 quite different Cambridge colleges, actually. So I've got a breadth of kind of university perspective. And when HEPI first asked me to do this, I didn't hesitate, because my strongest instinct when I meet an unfamiliar challenge is to seek out those who might have solved it before. And yet my broad experience of universities is that their instincts are quite self-referential. The first question is not which enterprise or company or sector has solved something like this before, it's which university has solved something like this before. I've had the privilege of being a guiding hand in the recruitment of 2 current vice-chancellors, and the breadth of their frame of reference is one of their key attributes. So I wouldn't want to suggest that this is something that I see in them. And there is a broader counterpoint to my self-referential point, which I'll come back to right at the end of this. So going back to when I first joined City over 15 years ago, I was struck immediately by two really big similarities in the environment between the publicly quoted and public service broadcaster and a university. The first of these was the way in which regulation and independence coexist, and the criticality and the very substantial workload involved in managing both equally well. The second was that both were talent businesses. Success was largely shaped by how effectively talented people who were dedicated to their work could thrive, as in do their best work, and deliver the collective purpose of the organisation. Going back to my start point, I said that my habit was to ask for help when I met new challenges. So when I was first asked to look at this, I went straight to the members of my board in Manchester for their views. And so what follows is a subset, because we've got limited time, of those views, and in no particular order, and noting that no one is suggesting here that we copy what others have done, just that we're curious about what led to success and failure in other places. So this is the list that people came up with. Streamers and membership organisations and the best in online delivery. They can teach us about effective process and delivery, largely digital. We all of us as we go through our lives, have very high expectations of mass customization. When it's done well, it delivers personalised and consistent engagement that we all lean into. And we bring those expectations into our work as staff members, and our students do when they come to learn from us. Those same companies can teach us about data analytics and the way in which data analytics support process and delivery. And I've heard fascinating conversations in our boardroom about that. Interestingly, our team in Manchester are going to talk to Formula One about agility and pace of change. As I said earlier, I think it's generally understood that cultural and creative organisations can teach us how to think about coexisting financial and non-financial objectives. They both exist in parallel and both are important. We can learn from the finance sector about effective ways to learn from radically different business models, which we know are all around us in HE. And an example of this that one board member gave me was the way in which the big financial retailers are adjusting their customer service and delivery to remain competitive with challenger brands. Again, very interesting conversation in the boardroom about challenger brands. From finance more generally, probably post 2008, we can learn about financial scenario planning, stress testing, and this is a really big one for me, a focus on the importance of capacity and capability in governance. From successful commercial companies, we can learn that in a complex environment, Alistair talked about this earlier, in which we are all under pressure, really good leadership at every level in the organisation makes the link between the poetry and the prose. Leadership is not a hierarchical concept, and in many well-run and successful settings, it's a key focus for early career training across the board. And good leadership in HE supports academics to navigate the inevitable ups and downs of grant-funded work, brings people together to solve problems, make decisions, create consensus, supports the work to reconcile those seemingly irreconcilable financial and non-financial objectives, and make sure that we're not continually reinventing the wheel in pockets across organisations. So I said at the beginning that I had a counterpoint to my earlier self-referential comment, and it's this. We can learn from companies like Unilever that work hard to support people to work across very different roles. So typically a Unilever CEO, as we know, will have worked across a range of areas: sales, technology, finance, HR. We still worry a lot, or I hear that we worry a lot across much of the sector about the separateness of academic and PS staff. And I reflect often that just as it is important for academic staff to reconcile to recognise the expertise of their PS colleagues, it's also important that PS colleagues, be they project managers, HR business partners, and finance team leaders, seek out those PIs, academic leaders who have substantial track records and skills in setting up and closing down sometimes huge project teams, cohering really disparate disciplines to achieve common goals, who've managed complex talent issues, huge budgets, and learned often how to design a successful institute. And it's really important that we build on both the PS expertise and that academic expertise to create something that works well together. So those are my kind of board's thoughts on this overall topic. And I'm going to hand back, I think, to you, Nick. Is that right?
Thank you, Philippa. Just before you do, I just want to sneak in one quick thing, which is that was a very impressive list of things that we could learn from other big sectors. And I'm just wondering, do we have the resources to, is that a resource intensive process, or is it a case that we can't afford not to do it, if you see what I mean?
Well, going to find other people who've solved your problem is one of the least resource intensive things to do, I think. Generally this stuff's all out there, I think. So that
Right.
instinct to look beyond, what another university might do. Universities share a lot of information with each other, and that's a good thing. But, it's kind of making sure that you think what might be in common with other settings and how can we learn from them. People will teach you a lot, and for free, to be honest.
Fantastic.
People are very happy to share their expertise. And isn't it interesting that we spend all our time academically thinking about evidence-based learning?
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
need to do that when we think about how we run our organizations as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Philippa. And of course, during my time on your board, I think the addition of an FE college principal, which is still the education family, made huge strides to what we did. So let's go to Khadir next. Thank you, Philippa. Khadir, what's your perspective on this?
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Philippa. Slightly regretting going after Philippa, given how compelling that was and how much it resonated with me, alongside the fact that there may be a bit of repetition in some of what I say. I want to start by recognizing that there's a huge diversity of institutions in the sector, and being cognizant of that in terms of the size, shape, offer, focus of institutions means that we need to avoid falling into the trap of kind of discussing and presenting ideas as if one size fits all or one solution might fit all. However, within that context, I do think there's 3 areas that I would posit the sector could be and should be looking at, if not already. And they come from my experiences of working in local and national government, and latterly the NHS. And I also want to caveat this by saying it's not as if the NHS, local and national government, haven't got their own challenges, and have and also recognising the different models and service provisions and the fact that the funding arrangements are very different too. But the first of the 3 that I wanted to pick up on was strategic planning. And when you hear and see institutions going into announcing kind of significant financial challenges, deficits, or significant staff in reductions, I do wonder a little bit about the level of thought possibly that's gone into strategic planning over a 3 to 5 year period. And I don't mean strategic planning in terms of the AFR that we all have to submit to the OFS and that has millions of lines of data. I mean the high level plan that sets out a roadmap, a trajectory, but that is sufficiently agile and responsive to the year on year kind of fluctuations that we're seeing in the HE market. And I use the word market deliberately, although I know it's not always appreciated by everyone within the sector. But it is a very, very, there is quite a lot of fluctuation at the moment in relation to demand and therefore income, and therefore financial sustainability. I do wonder about how, and Philippa used this word, how agile we are, what the plan A is, plan B is, what plan C is, the level of contingency built in, the level of agility planned in relation to responding to what ultimately the market provides on any given year in terms of student numbers, be it home, international, UG, PG, etc. And I do think there's often quite a level of optimism bias built into planning. And I think we need to think a bit more carefully about that and whether we've got the right capacity, capabilities, and whether we are challenging ourselves sufficiently at the executive and board level around financial sustainability and understanding how we plan and respond to what we see on any given year. The second point I wanted to reflect on was investing in leadership, and Philippa flagged this as well. The NHS, certainly from my experience, invests a huge amount in leadership, and again at the entry level. Now, I wasn't an NHS graduate scheme entrant into the NHS, and I used to remind colleagues of it quite regularly. But many of my colleagues were in NHS management, and through that process, quite early on, it was clear. The message was clear to them: management and leadership is something that the NHS takes seriously. It needs to be thought through. It needs to be invested in. Staff need to be developed as they grow in their leadership roles in the NHS, and that goes all the way through to the executive and right up to the board. And I was struck by the chair of the OFS referencing recently, I think it was at the Wonky conference, where he reflected that sometimes some of our trustees or council members see their role as a kind of a charitable contribution to higher education, and perhaps, and I don't want to talk in general terms, not always fully focused on the legal and the fiduciary responsibilities of managing multi-million and in some cases billion-pound organisations and institutions. And I think there's something similar at possibly the executive level. I've been quite struck coming into the sector over the last kind of 4 or 5 years by how much rigour goes into academic promotions, in evidencing academic credentials. But I'm not sure we always have the same expectations of academic colleagues in leadership roles. And I sometimes worry that it's a bit of a sink or swim approach and or mentality. And and again, I don't mean to make generalizations here, but I do think we need to be investing as a sector into academic leadership within universities, so that they have the skills and abilities to be able to take on the huge burdens of responsibility that they're expected to carry and the decisions that they're expected to make, alongside professional service colleagues who often have been trained in those expectations all the way up and through their careers, sometimes from in and out of the sector, so can bring that. And I'm not sure we are always investing the same in our academic leaders in the way that professional service colleagues expect and understand. And the final challenge that I put is shared services. We're hearing a lot about shared services at the moment, and my example, which others may have heard, and I'm sorry to keep repeating wherever I have the opportunity. Obviously SOAS is in Bloomsbury. Within 1 square mile, there's probably 5 institutions, independent, autonomous, statutory bodies with their own boards, etc. We all have our own HR, finance, estates, IT. We all have our own professional service functions operating independently and in silos. we barely share Wi-Fi. It strikes me that we need to have those conversations, which many of us are trying, but I'm not sure how much progress we're making. And that may just be a reflection of my abilities to influence this space. But there's huge opportunities to drive efficiency there without undermining independence, without undermining autonomy, but freeing up resources to invest back in the academic project and back in the mission of those institutions. I'll stop there, Nick, and hand back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for those things. Just before you turn your camera off, given your background and given what you just said, um, including about how people approach the charitable mission of universities, do you have a sense of which area of life university should learn the most from? In other words, generally they're large charities, um, but they're on a scale sometimes of very large listed companies. Sometimes people think they're public sector when actually they're not public sector. Do you think there's one particular realm of life we should be learning more from than others, or do you think they're all relevant?
Well, so from the NHS, I'm an associate non-exec on an NHS trust board, and the level of rigor the board puts into assuring itself both of its fiduciary responsibilities, but also of its responsibilities in terms of clinical quality and safety. And so they see both of those. They understand the tension, but they understand that ultimately they have responsibilities in both areas. And the same could be applied in universities in terms of the student experience, while at the same time the financial sustainability.
Thank you. Fascinating. And I can't tell you how many blogs we receive, both from academics and students, saying they think university leaders spend too much time talking about over financialization. Well, of course, the financial challenges to the sector are real. But let's go to Rod. Do keep the questions coming in. There's a nice list of questions, but I want to go through as many of them as possible. Let's go to Rod.
Thank you, Nick, and my fellow speakers. Fascinating discussion, a lot to learn. Just to add a little bit about my own context, it is a great privilege to serve as the University of Bradford chair. I've also had 40 years working across universities globally, but also on the governing bodies of schools and further education colleges, as well as having attended board meetings for many years as a FTSE 100 PLC. Despite all of that, I couldn't resist putting the exam question into Google to see what AI would have to say about the answer to the question. And the answer was given. Higher education I'm going to read it out, so just bear with me. Higher education can learn from other sectors like tech and business by adopting data-driven strategies, focusing on practical employability through industry partnerships, embracing digital transformation for accessibility, fostering innovative and agile approaches to curriculum, improving equity and inclusion by learning from corporate diversity initiatives and creating third spaces for cross-functional collaboration. Quite a mouthful. And a lot of nonsense in the AI response to the question, and lots of those areas actually I think higher education probably has a lot to offer other sectors, although not necessarily on diversity, which of leadership, which might be another area to discuss. But I think it does show what a difficult question this is. All sectors probably contain more variability within them than between them. And although that might be a bit less true in higher education, which because of its history, purpose and structure, which let's not forget has served it very well, does seem to have a degree of homogeneity in some aspects globally, not only in the UK, and ultimately reflected in approach and culture. When it comes to culture, there are no rights or wrongs, but self-awareness of culture is an important issue. And one cultural theme that stands out for me is around process versus outcome. And I just want to refer to an article that Daniel Finkelstein wrote in the Times on the 6th of January about the US intervention in Venezuela. Please bear with me. There's no proposal here about whether it was right or wrong, but it was a fascinating analysis. And I'll just read out a section of it. Donald Trump had told a startled collection of correspondents gathered at his Palm Beach social club that he now intended to run Venezuela. There were no answers on how he intended to do it, or even how he intended to be in a position to do it. He did not know how long he was going to do it for, or even how he would know it was time to stop doing it. As a way of conducting government, it was, to say the least, unconventional, and it's hard not to foresee trouble ahead as a result. But Maduro has been a catastrophe for the people of Venezuela. He's been a nightmare for his country's neighbors. He cheated in the election, losing despite all of his repression, and he isn't legitimate in any way. Yet there he was. For years and years, there he still was. And now he no longer is, because Trump has removed him. Now, I'm not arguing for or against any of that, but it was a fascinating analysis. And he goes on to talk about Daniel Wang's book, Breakneck, which describes America and Britain as very loyally societies which move too slowly, but also points out that the conflict between process and progress isn't so much a choice as a tension to be aware of. We can't do without progress, and we can't do without process. The world is in desperate need of statesmen able to find a middle path. And this issue of process versus outcome is an important one for universities to consider. Universities, for very good reason, require a lot of process for decision making. Decisions go through committees, sometimes more than once. And the processes are important given the way universities work, their charters and statutes, and they do indeed form the very fabric of what makes a university excellent. And I wouldn't for a moment argue that they should be removed. But equally, it's too easy to end up with process as the goal, not progress. That the knock-on effect can be a lack of speed in decision making compared with other sectors, and maybe even worse, a feeling the job is done if the process is complete. Now, there's no silver bullet to solve that sort of problem, but those universities able to find a middle path, looking at perhaps other sectors, will have greater agility, and that will give them advantage in the future, particularly at a time when there's so much change is happening and required. All sectors do have this challenge, but few more than higher education, and not a problem. I don't think it is a problem. It can be characterized as over-regulation or too much governance. Schools and colleges, for example, make decisions relatively quickly, despite having very strong governance and even stronger regulation to deal with. And governing bodies have an incredibly important role to play. Governing bodies or councils who are fully engaged, really deeply engaged in the universities, can play a role helping to ensure decisions are made faster and well, or potentially more slowly. Yeah, perhaps that's an issue for discussion. Back to you, Nick.
Thank you very much, Rod. I think I found myself agreeing with everything you had said. And then I thought of the sentence that people sometimes say, that the reason Oxford is such a successful university is because nobody really understands how it works, and change always takes decades, because it does at least stop bad changes as well as maybe limit good changes. But I'll leave that thought hanging in the air. So let's go to the Q&A, because we've got lots of questions coming in thick and fast. I'm going to try and take them broadly in the order that they prove most popular. The first question is actually an anonymous one, but it's got a comment underneath from Johnny Rich. So I might look to Johnny Rich to ask his own question and try and envelop the anonymous one above. Johnny, we'll turn your microphone on. You know the score.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you, everybody else.
Tell people who you are, Johnny, in case people don't know.
Sorry, I'm Johnny Rich. I'm the Chief Executive of the Engineering Professors Council and of PUSH. and various other things. Yeah, the anonymous question was around flipping the question to ask about what areas can't HE learn about it with specific regard to governance. But I was broadening it out and saying beyond governance, are there any other things that are unique to higher education? So where analogies won't work with other sectors, particularly around the strange tension that you get between competition and collaboration in higher education.
Thank you. There's a comment from Jill Duffy, who's a board member at Oxford Brookes University, on that as well. People might want to look at. Luke, let's go to Luke Reynolds next. Luke, you've put a couple of comments in, including a very popular question.
Yeah, hi there. So Luke Reynolds, I'm Associate Director of Strategic Planning at University of Southampton. So I've worked in strategic planning across multiple universities in the sector over the last decade. And I've often tried to look externally for support, what people are doing elsewhere, and really struggled. Within the sector, we've got HESPA, who are Higher Education Strategic Planning Association, really good. So that's really useful. But trying to get that external knowledge has been really hard. So any advice on kind of where to go, who to talk to, how to get contact with these people in other organisations and other sectors who we can learn from?
Thank you, Luke. And then I'm going to go to Mary Kernock-Cook, because there's the next most popular question is about shared services, and then the one after that is by Mary, which is also on shared services. So Mary is a HEPI trustee and former CEO of UCAS, has many other roles. Mary.
Morning, everyone. Happy New Year, and thanks for really thought-provoking start to this webinar. I was really wanting to pick up Khadir's point about SOAS being in, so close to so many other institutions, and perhaps the need to consider shared services, particularly in professional services, back office type stuff. And I just wanted to challenge that, because I think a lot of universities are actually many hundreds of £1 million turnover organizations, which I think should be big enough to sustain their own finance, HR, IT, etc. And I wondered whether there's, especially given how HE tends to work with others, whether there's anything really to be gained, and they wouldn't be better putting the resources into transforming their own services rather than trying to do it across other organizations, which will have different priorities and different data systems, and make it all very complex and potentially painful and unsuccessful.
Thank you, Mary. I'm going to go back to the panel. Please try and keep your answers as short as possible, even though I know you'll have lots to say, because I do want to get in at least one more and maybe even two more rounds questions. So let's go in a reverse order this time. Rod.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick up just on Luke and Mary's questions. I think, Luke, on the where to go, I would say use your governing bodies. I mean, governing bodies typically have lay members who come from a variety of different sectors, and certainly it's the case at Bradford. So we're actually trying, we want to involve our governing body a lot more in providing this sort of advice from other sectors. To Mary's question around, shared services, I think more broadly on collaboration, I would say collaboration across the sector is good, but make sure you've achieved all of the efficiencies you can yourself first. Otherwise, you are potentially going to layer even more complexity on top of, so really focusing in on where you can make those improvements within your own institution. It's not necessarily a silver bullet to go for collaboration, because it might actually slow things down. That would be just something to be careful of.
Thanks, Rod. Khadir.
Yeah, no, I think the point on shared services is an interesting challenge, and I do accept the challenge. Not all organisations, institutions are the same shape, size. UCL, $1 billion plus down the road from me, perhaps doesn't need to explore that, and perhaps needs to focus on just driving efficiency within it. My challenge back is, and it'd be interesting to hear Philippa's point as an ex-HRD. When you've experienced one payroll service, you've probably experienced them all, and there's an opportunity there. The NHS serves 2 million people plus every month in terms of shared business services and payroll services across England, if not the UK. I'm sure there's opportunities there, but I recognise one size doesn't fit all, and I also hear Rob's point about driving efficiencies and making sure you're getting the best value within an institution before seeking elsewhere.
Thank you, Khadir. You are, of course, already part of a shared service in the University of London, I guess, as SOAS.
Yes, limited, but yes.
Yeah. Philippa.
Thanks. So 3 quick comments. Completely endorse Rob's point. If you're going to merge anything or change anything, sort yourself out first. Don't rely on the process to do that. Fastest way to misery. Shared services can be done well or badly. They are not in and of themselves a good or a bad. And so if you think you're going to do it well, then do it. If you think you might not, or you might not have the expertise or the capacity to do that, then be really careful. So many of these things are not good or bad in and of themselves. They can be badly done or well done. I think the question about competition and collaboration is really interesting. There are so many places where, and so many different sectors where you, in different parts of your operation and different bits of the way in which you think, you both collaborate and compete. And the critical thing is the whole organization understands that. So there are lots of areas where manufacturers will co-produce with other people with whom actually in the marketplace they compete heavily. So I think that you might compete and collaborate with the same institutions is not unprecedented or unusual, but it does require a lot of careful management, and it requires everyone understanding where the Chinese walls are, where the boundaries lie, and what it's work, but it's not unprecedented. I'm interested in I was trying to reflect, where do I get all my information about other sectors from? And our board, we call it a board, we don't call it a council of governors, it's a board, has a lot of people with a huge amount of expertise, and I do go to them. I'm lucky in that my work life involves finding out a lot. I get to be curious about lots of different settings all the time. I get a lot from LinkedIn, actually. The number of times I save, really, really clever pieces that set out what different organizations have done on LinkedIn. I'll save several a week. I know it sounds silly, but there's a lot out there that will take you to who's doing this stuff well.
Thank you, Philippa. I'm intrigued by that, because I find LinkedIn the hardest of all those social media networks to get my head around. But
well, the difference is, Nick, I never post anything.
Yeah. So let's go to the rest of the questions, because there's some great questions coming in. Nicola, who is the chair of Gloucestershire, I think, but chair of University. Nicola, you've gone about recruiting leaders.
Hi, Nick. Thank you. And thank you very much, speakers. Really, really great topic. So my question is around a little bit of context, if I may. I also chair CUC, and in that capacity was delighted to attend a new VC session to talk about governance and the governance code. I must confess, although individually they were all marvellous, I was slightly depressed to be in a room with 10 new vice-chancellors, of whom 8 were white professors male and 2 were white professors female. Again, individually, you pick the best person for the job, but as a sector, where the hell are we getting our learning from? I think we've got, 3 or 4 vice-chancellors who are not academics. I think we might have 1 who's come from a professional services route. We've got a serious diversity issue at the very top, and it's a very, very small sector. So all of the people have been pro-VCs, deputy vice-chancellors, etc., and sort of swirling around in this ivory tower. And I think, Philippa, you absolutely hit the nail on the head with your self-referential comment as you opened it up. That's exactly been my experience. And I'm delighted to hear that you no longer have a council, you have a board, because I think we need to move our language into something which is much more meaningful and which takes some of those barriers down. So my question is, should we be much, much braver as a sector at recruiting from outside our sector to the skills that we require?
Thank you. Thank you, Nicola. Very crisp question. Then Naomi, can we go to Naomi Sharples? Who's actually put a comment on an anonymous question, but I think she's interested in the same thing. So I don't know if Naomi's willing to articulate her thought and the anonymous thought together. And if not, I can read it out.
Sorry, am I there?
Yeah, we can hear you beautifully.
Yes. Yeah. Was it the comment about the systems?
Yes, exactly.
We have, I always think, we have a way of thinking about our culture, supports our structures, supports our systems, supports our core tasks. And yet, if anything's going to become problematic of delivering a good quality core task, which for most of us is research or teaching and learning, it's our systems, our clunky systems. And yet we just struggle with them, or, we try to find ways through. And, I've worked in 3 educational organisations. They've all got clunky systems. I might have been unlucky, but I think there might be more clunky systems.
Naomi, which is your institution currently?
So at the moment, I'm in University of Salford, and we are trying to declunk our systems. But I always think it's, if timetabling, it's like timetabling for universities should be like wheels for Toyota. Yeah. We shouldn't be able to get it wrong, and yet, good grief, we do.
You may be getting emails from software companies after asking that question.
Well, maybe, yeah.
So let's go next to, I'm going to take one more, Chris Parr, who's a journalist. Chris.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, it's a big picture question, really. Like, loads of universities have redundancy schemes, they're cutting courses. There's been lots of questions asked about how good governance is in HE. Does that mean that in general, university leaders and governing bodies have done a bad job? Could they have been more proactive in stopping these problems coming? Or is it just an outcome of circumstance?
Thank you, Chris. And so we've had 3 questions. I'm just going to sneak in one more under the radar, which is the anonymous one, just above Chris's one, which is about training. Big preoccupation for Advance HE in particular. In other sectors, people are trained and supported before stepping into leadership roles. Do we need to be more deliberate about training and supporting academic leaders? And what might that look like in practice? So I'm going to revert to the original order. Philippa.
Okay, thanks for those questions. And actually, the answer to 2 of them is a bit the same. I feel really strongly that we should be supporting academic future leaders from the off with early career training. It's so important. And when I talk to early career researchers and say, what training do you get? And ask, would you be interested in leadership training? They would love it. It's a really, really important part of how you think about how you shape the world around you. So I'm wholly positive about that. And I think it partly answers Nicola's question. If everyone who starts an early career researcher start to kind of learn to lead the world around them, and I go back to my leadership is a non-hierarchical concept. You act as a leader every day. You're going to end up with a much broader cadre of people who think that leading others is a sensible way to spend your time and is not something that's number 19 on your to-do list when actually you've got really other more important things to do. So I think that's it's a really big part of the picture. In terms of leadership, actually recruiting right at the top, I've recruited 2 vice-chancellors, and my kind of core was to work out what we wanted and what we needed. And I did that slightly differently in different organizations. But, as Nick knows, in Manchester, I did nearly 40 meetings with nearly 1,000 staff to talk about what our next leader should be. And from all of that, created a specification, and then we went out to a global search. So it was, it was a global search, but it was a community appointment. And I think that is always going to be incredibly important to us. And that worked. We did end up appointing in Manchester an academic, but I did not start with the premise that it had to be one.
Thank
we
you.
had a criteria. Sorry, I love declunking is my word of the day. I think it's a fantastic word. I would, you may have seen our new Manchester strategy has foundations and leaps. The foundations are all the things we've got to get right before we can leap forward. And the foundations are all about declunking, and it's incredibly important.
Thank you, Philippa. If we had longer, I would ask you whether you felt it was easier for a non-research intensive university to recruit from outside the sector, given the perception of existing staff, than a big research intensive. But I'll just leave that thought hanging and go to Khadir. You're just on mute, Khadir. There we are.
Sorry, Nick. My internet seems to be playing up a little bit, so apologies if it gets sticky. I just want to pick up the question about leadership. I do think there's something that needs some thought here. The idea that a NHS chief executive didn't have to be a clinician from 30 years ago. I'm not suggesting one is right or one is wrong, one is better or one is worse. You have clinical leaders who are chief execs in the NHS. You have non-clinicians who are chief execs in the NHS. I am interested in the fact that in HE it feels it's very unlikely you can be a vice-chancellor or a leader of a HE institution if you are not an academic and a professor at that. And I do think there's some local government, you have elected leaders and the executive. In the civil service, obviously you have politicians and you have civil service director generals. In the NHS, you'll have clinical leaders as well as managerial leaders. And at every point, it's recognised as a partnership. And I don't think a non-academic lead in an institution needs to necessarily suggest that you're moving away from the academic mission of an institution. And I think there's something to unpack and explore there, because it feels as if there's some sacred cows that do not necessarily serve us well all the time. I'm suggesting that we should be possibly more agnostic as opposed to definitive about these things.
Thank you, Khadir. And of course, another way to get extensive expertise is to recruit people who might have already been in higher education, but in a different country. So they bring a different, and both, of course, Manchester and SOAS are led by people who've led institutions in other countries. But Rod, over to you.
Yeah, I'll pick up Naomi's question on technology and clunky systems. I think it is the case that universities have generally been much more comfortable investing in estate, new buildings and what have you. And it's harder to get technology investments through, probably something that universities are just less used to doing. And I do think that needs to change. I think there is some evidence of it changing, but thinking of technology as part of the estates is perhaps a way of thinking about that. I think it's a great question, and more investment in technology will be needed. Back office, as well as learning related technologies. On the governance question, I don't want to duck that very difficult question. I sorry, I didn't pick up the name of the asker. Have governing bodies done a bad job? It's certainly now one of the top 6 issues for the OFS, I think, is that to look at the work of governing bodies. The role of a governing body, among many other things, is to make sure that the institution is anticipating the future. And I suppose, we can certainly say that the future probably wasn't anticipated sufficiently well over the last few years in terms of where we are now. There's quite a lot of reacting going on. I would rather put it more positively, because, by the way, it's not just the governing bodies, the government. I think everyone was sort of has been taken by surprise a little bit and perhaps some of these things could have been anticipated. I think the best way to address it is for governing bodies to become better at anticipating the future. And Khadir talked about optimism bias and what have you. That's part of it. We've got to be realistic as well as optimistic and hopeful for the future. What's the way to solve that? Then it must surely be about even ever greater engagement between governing bodies and the institution as a whole. And I think it's amazing what Philippa did in those 40 separate meetings. But I think governing body engagement with an institution is a big opportunity for improvement generally across the sector, because governing bodies are ultimately accountable for these things, and that does mean much greater sense of partnership working between governing bodies and university and the university executive leadership.
Thank you, Rod. We're very close to time, and we do have a hard cutoff at midday, so I apologise if we didn't get to your questions, but I know all three panelists are always very open, and we will capture people's thoughts. So we can always continue this conversation another fora. But just, Rod, just before, very final word, can we afford, as a sector, the sort of IT skills we need to do the sort of systems changes that you were just referring to? Because the private sector pay a hell of a lot more for IT skills than we are often willing to pay.
Well, I think the right question is with any strategy is you set your priorities. Strategies are about things you're deciding not to do as well as things you're deciding to do. If it's prioritized as part of the strategy, then the question really is, can we afford not to do it? I think that really is the question. And there will need to be more investments going into technology. It won't be easy. We'll need to find ways to finance them versus other things that need financing. There are many creative ways of doing that, working with technology providers themselves very often. So I think innovative discussions, innovation on that very subject is really worthwhile, and we should involve the technology providers in those conversations too.
Thank you. Well, let's end on that positive point, not least because Philippa and Khadir were nodding as you were talking. And I'm going to call a halt to proceedings here, other than to say thank you to you three panelists for being so open and wide-ranging in your comments and bringing your experience to this issue. Thank you in particular to my colleagues Emma and Carol, who've done a huge amount of work behind the scenes setting this up. Thank you to Advance HE, without whom we couldn't put on either this event or the in-person events coming up in February and March. Do look out for other things we've got coming up listed on the HEPI website, including a report we've got coming out later this week, the tricky issue of students' attitudes towards free speech in higher education. Thank you for staying for the full hour. We've recorded the session. It'll be up on our YouTube YouTube channel later. And if it's not too late to say it, I hope you're all having a very happy new year. Thank you.